Walking through the doors of the veterinary hospital that day, I was all set for another long shift. The place was a second home to me, a haven where my modest upbringing didn't matter, and my love for animals could shine. Little did I know, my world was about to tilt on its axis. He was there, leaning against the front desk, chatting with Janet, one of our seasoned nurses. His laughter filled the room, easy and genuine, catching my attention immediately. I couldn't help but pause, struck by the warmth in his eyes when he smiled. "Can I help you?" I asked, approaching them with a mix of curiosity and professional courtesy. "Oh, I was just thanking Janet here for taking care of Whiskers last week." "You guys do amazing work," he replied, his gaze meeting mine. There was an instant spark, an unspoken connection that I felt deep in my bones. "I'm Jarian," he added, extending his hand, which I shook, feeling a jolt of electricity at the contact. "I'm Carol," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm glad Whiskers is doing better. It's our job to make sure they get the care they need." Jarian nodded, his smile widening. "I can see the passion you all have for your work. It's inspiring. Actually, I'm here to volunteer. I want to help out in any way I can." His admission took me by surprise. Volunteers were common, but there was something about Jarian, a sincerity that couldn't be faked. His simple, unassuming manner was refreshing, especially when he shared that he came from a well-to-do family. It was a detail he mentioned offhandedly, as if it were the least interesting thing about him. We spent the rest of the afternoon working side by side, Jarian throwing himself into the tasks with an eagerness that was both endearing and slightly amusing. From feeding the animals to cleaning their enclosures, he didn't shy away from any job, no matter how dirty. After that first meeting at the veterinary hospital, things between Jarian and me started moving at a pace neither of us expected, but both secretly hoped for. Our initial connection over the animals quickly blossomed into something more, something real and tangible. Our first date was a simple affair. Jarian took me to a small, cozy cafe tucked away on a street I'd passed 1,000 times but never noticed. The place was a reflection of us, unpretentious and genuine. Over cups of coffee that turned cold because we were too engrossed in conversation, we discovered the myriad ways our lives intersected, from our mutual love for old movies to our uncanny ability to quote lines from obscure books. "We're quite the pair, aren't we?" Jarian joked, his eyes sparkling with amusement as he recited a line from one of my favorite novels, one I'd mentioned in passing. I laughed, surprised and delighted by his memory and effort. "Yeah, a regular Bonnie and Clyde," I quipped back, not missing a beat. But instead of crime, we were united by our shared passions and the laughter that came so easily between us. Date after date, our connection deepened. We found joy in the simple things, a walk in the park, a visit to a local animal shelter, or just sitting together in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. It was during these moments that I saw the true Jarian, the man behind the wealth and the expectations that came with it. He was kind, compassionate, and genuinely interested in making a difference, qualities that resonated with my own values and aspirations. As those early dates turned into weeks, and weeks into months, I couldn't help but feel grateful for that chance encounter at the veterinary hospital. Meeting Jarian's parents was a milestone I approached with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Despite Jarian's reassurances, the butterflies in my stomach were more like a swarm of bees as we drove up to his family's estate. It was grand, far removed from the humble surroundings I was accustomed to, and it served as a stark reminder of our differing worlds. Jarian squeezed my hand as we walked up to the door, his smile comforting yet unable to completely ease my nerves. "They're going to love you," he whispered, just as the door swung open to reveal his parents. His father, Mr. Eldridge, was the first to greet us, his demeanor warm and welcoming. "Jarian, my boy. And you must be Carol. We've heard so much about you," he said, extending a hand that enveloped mine in a firm, friendly shake. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Eldridge." "It's a pleasure to meet you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Then came Martha, Mrs. Eldridge, the woman who would soon become my infamous mother-in-law. Her appearance was impeccable, but her eyes scrutinized me in a way that made me feel like I was back in high school, desperately trying to fit in with the cool crowd. "So, Carol, Jerian tells us you work at a veterinary clinic. That must be interesting," she began, her tone implying that interesting was a euphemism for less than impressive. "Yes, Mrs. Eldridge. It's very fulfilling work. I've always loved animals," I answered, trying to keep my voice even despite the clear judgment in hers. "And your family? Jerian mentioned they're from the countryside. Do you visit often? I imagine it's quite different from the city life," she continued, each question laced with an underlying critique of my background. "My parents are wonderful people. We're very close, and yes, it's a different pace of life, but it's where I call home," I said, my pride in my roots firm, despite her not-so-subtle digs. Dinner was an exercise in maintaining composure. Mrs. Eldridge's comments ranged from backhanded compliments about my quaint upbringing to outright interrogations about whether I had ever traveled abroad or dined in fine restaurants. Each question felt like a test I hadn't studied for, her words designed to highlight our differences rather than find common ground. Jerian, bless him, tried to steer the conversation to safer waters, interjecting with stories of our time together that had everyone laughing, everyone except his mother, who seemed determined to find fault in anything related to me. It was when she asked, "Carol, dear, have you decided on a wedding dress yet? Or are you planning to make do with something homemade?" that I realized this wasn't just about getting to know me. It was about her asserting a perceived superiority, her way of reminding me that I didn't belong. I smiled, a genuine one born of the confidence Jerian's love gave me. "Mrs. Eldridge, I believe a wedding dress should reflect the love and commitment of the couple, not the price tag. Jerian and I are focused on what comes after the wedding, building a life together based on respect, love, and understanding." The silence that followed was palpable. Even Mrs. Eldridge seemed momentarily at a loss, her fork paused mid-air. Mr. Eldridge, however, nodded in approval, a twinkle in his eye as he looked at me. "Well said, Carol. Well said indeed." The ride home was quiet, but Jerian broke the silence with an apology that was heartfelt yet unnecessary. "I'm sorry about my mom. She can be difficult." I squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his support. "It's okay, Jerian. Your love is all the validation I need. Together, we'll get through anything." As the wedding preparations unfolded, Martha made it her mission to underline our differences at every turn. Her intrusion wasn't just unwelcome, it was downright aggressive. She had a comment for everything, from the color scheme of the hall to the floral arrangements and even the style of our invitation cards. One evening, as Jerian and I were finalizing the guest list, Mrs. Eldridge dropped by unannounced, her eyes scanning our choices with evident disapproval. "You're not seriously considering this shade of green for the decor, are you? It's so provincial," she remarked, her nose wrinkled as if she'd smelled something foul. I tried to keep my cool, but her next comment about our guest list set me off. "And these friends of yours, they're hardly the sort one expects at a wedding of our stature. It might be best to leave them off the list, don't you think?" I felt a flash of anger, but managed to keep my voice steady. "Mrs. Eldridge, Jerian and I have decided on the guest list together. Everyone we care about will be there, regardless of their status." Her lips pursed into a thin line, clearly not used to being contradicted. The tension only escalated when she turned her attention to my wedding dress, which I'd chosen for its simplicity and elegance. "That dress," she sniffed. "It's charming if you're attending a country fair, perhaps. But for a wedding in our family? It's hardly appropriate." I bit back a retort, my hands clenched at my sides. Jerian, sensing the brewing storm, tried to intervene, but his mother was on a roll. "And where are you planning to honeymoon?" "A quaint little barn in the countryside?" she asked, her voice dripping with malice. That was the last straw. "Our honeymoon plans are our business," I shot back, the hurt clear in my voice. "Just like every other decision about this wedding. It's about what makes us happy, not about living up to some outdated standards." Mrs. Eldridge's eyes narrowed, but before she could retort, Jerian stepped in. "Mom, that's enough. This is our wedding, Carol's and mine. We're making the decisions that are right for us. If you can't support that, maybe you should reconsider your involvement in the planning." The room went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Eldridge huffed, muttered something under her breath about speaking later, and stormed out. After she left, the air felt lighter, as if her departure had lifted a weight from the room. Jerian wrapped his arms around me, his apology whispered in my ear. "I'm sorry, Carol. I don't know what's gotten into her. It's not your fault," I sighed, leaning into his embrace. "But I'm glad you said something. This is our wedding, our day. It should be about us, not about pleasing everyone else." The wedding day, supposed to be the happiest of my life, started off just like I'd always dreamed. The church ceremony was beautiful, filled with love and promise. I stood there, in my simple yet elegant dress, feeling truly beautiful and cherished, hand in hand with Jerian, my soon-to-be husband. But amidst the joy, a nagging feeling tugged at me. Glancing over, I caught my mother-in-law's expectant look, her smirk barely hidden. It was clear she was plotting something, but I pushed the thought aside, hoping for the best. The ceremony concluded without a hitch, and as we headed to the reception, I tried to hold on to the happiness of the moment. However, as soon as we arrived, I saw her again, my mother-in-law, moving towards the microphone with a purpose. My heart sank. With all eyes on her, she began, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "Ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about our newest family member." Her gaze locked with mine, and I felt a chill. Coming from such humble beginnings, it's truly remarkable how resourceful Carol has been. From the village to here, embracing our family with open arms, like a true freeloader, and, dare I say, a beggar at our doorstep. The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uncomfortable glances. Even those from Jerian's side, the so-called high society, looked taken aback by her harsh words. I stood frozen, shock giving way to humiliation, tears blurring my vision as I heard a few gasps and murmurs ripple through the crowd. Beside me, I could see my parents, their faces flushed with shame, hurt by the cruel words aimed at their daughter. Before I could process everything, Jerian was by my side, his voice filled with anger and apology. "I'm so sorry, Carol. I had no idea she'd stoop this low," he whispered, his arm wrapping around me in support. But before we could react further, an unexpected ally emerged. Jerian's grandmother, a respected matriarch of the family, stood up, her presence commanding attention. "Enough," she boomed, her voice cutting through the tension. "I cannot believe what I'm hearing. This woman, who speaks so ill of simplicity and humility, seems to forget her own roots. Did you all know? She herself was once nothing more than a servant in our household. And now, look how she turns her nose up at those very beginnings." The room erupted in whispers, the tables turned. My mother-in-law's face went from smug satisfaction to utter horror, her cheeks burning red as the grandmother continued to dismantle her facade of superiority. "This girl, Carol, has shown more grace and dignity than you ever have," the grandmother said, her gaze softening as she looked at me. "She is welcome in our family, not for her background, but for her heart." The reception that followed was a blur. My mother-in-law, now the subject of whispered conversations, left early, her exit barely noticed in the renewed celebration. Jerian was by my side throughout, his apologies unnecessary as his love and support spoke volumes. The room was still buzzing from the grandmother's unexpected defense of me. Guests whispered among themselves, casting sidelong glances at the now absent mother-in-law. Jerian squeezed my hand under the table, a silent promise of solidarity. "Can you believe what just happened?" Jerian asked, his voice a mix of astonishment and relief. I shook my head, still processing the whirlwind of emotions. "No, Jerian, your grandmother, she was incredible. I didn't think anyone would stand up to your mother like that, let alone in such a public way." Jerian smiled, a look of pride crossing his face. "Grandma has always been the matriarch of our family. She doesn't tolerate injustice or cruelty. I guess I forgot how formidable she can be. We were interrupted by the approach of the very woman of the hour, Jerian's grandmother. Her presence commanded respect, yet there was a warmth in her eyes as she looked at us. "Carol, dear, I hope you're feeling better after that unpleasantness," she said, her voice firm but kind. "Thank you, Mrs. Eldridge. Your words meant the world to me. I was feeling pretty low, but you've turned the whole evening around," I replied, gratitude swelling in my heart. She waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense, my dear. It was long overdue. That woman needed to be reminded of her place and to learn respect. You are a part of this family now, and we protect our own." Jerian's father joined us, a sheepish look on his face. "Carol, I'm sorry for my wife's behavior. I hope you can forgive us for any hurt she's caused." I nodded, understanding the difficult position he was in. "Thank you, Mr. Eldridge. Today has been a whirlwind, but your family's support has made all the difference." As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the room lightened. Guests came up to us, offering their congratulations and, in some cases, apologies for the earlier drama. It was clear that the tide had turned, not just in terms of the evening's events, but in how I was viewed by Jerian's family and their social circle. Later, as Jerian and I took to the dance floor, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, not over his mother, but over the situation. We had faced adversity head-on and come out stronger on the other side. "Jerian," I said, as we swayed to the music, "today has been a lot. But I've never been more sure about us. Your family's support, especially your grandmother's, has shown me that we can handle anything together." The atmosphere at Jerian's family home was charged as we gathered for the meeting his grandmother had called. After the wedding's tumultuous events, I was anxious about facing everyone again, especially Jerian's mother. However, Jerian squeezed my hand reassuringly as we took our seats in the large living room, filled with generations of Eldridges and a palpable tension. Jerian's grandmother, the undeniable matriarch, stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding attention. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "We're here to address a matter that concerns the dignity and unity of our family." Jerian's mother sat rigid, her eyes darting around the room, perhaps seeking an ally or preparing for a counterattack. Jerian, ever the peacemaker, spoke up first. "Grandma, I know things got out of hand at the wedding. I want to apologize on behalf of—" His grandmother raised a hand, silencing him. "Jerian, my boy, this isn't about placing blame on anyone. It's about setting things right." She then turned her gaze to me. "Carol, you've shown nothing but grace and patience in the face of less than welcoming behavior. For that, you have my respect." I nodded, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Eldridge. I just want what's best for Jerian and to be a part of this family." The room was silent, all eyes on us, when suddenly Jerian's mother stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I've listened enough. This girl," she gestured wildly towards me, "has turned everyone against me. And you," she pointed accusingly at her mother-in-law, "you humiliate me in front of the whole family." Jerian's grandmother remained unfazed. "I stated the truth. You forgot where you came from, and you tried to belittle Carol for her origins. That's not the Eldridge way." Jerian's father finally spoke, his voice firm. "Enough, Martha. Your behavior has been unacceptable. It's time you reflect on your actions and their impact on our family's reputation." The room went quiet again as the weight of his words settled in. Jerian's mother sank back into her chair, her defiance fading. The grandmother continued, "We are a family. And families support and lift each other up, not tear each other down. Carol, you are welcome here, always." As the family meeting began to wind down, with the air still heavy from the discussions and revelations, Jerian's grandmother, the respected matriarch, had one more issue to address. She cleared her throat, signaling that she wasn't quite finished, drawing the room's attention once again. "Now, there's another matter I need to bring to light," she started, her tone serious, hinting at the gravity of what was to come. From her purse, she pulled out a long list, the paper rustling loudly in the quiet room. It's come to my attention that Martha's spending has been, to put it mildly, extravagant and irresponsible over the past month. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the list that seemed to unravel like a scroll. Jerian's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier defiance melting into panic. These expenses, the grandmother continued, are not only frivolous, but are bleeding our family resources dry. This cannot go on. Martha, now pale, looked around, perhaps hoping for an ally, but finding none, she turned to her husband, desperation in her voice. You can't let her do this to me. You know we need the money for. Her husband, a man who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up, his voice firm and devoid of any warmth he might have previously held for her. I agree with my mother. It's time you learned the value of hard work, Martha. I won't support your lavish lifestyle anymore. Martha's eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The realization that she was truly alone in this, that her actions had consequences, seemed to finally dawn on her. And if your behavior continues along this path, he added, the threat clear in his tone, I will have no choice but to seek a divorce. Our family's reputation and well-being come first. The finality in his statement left no room for argument. Martha was visibly shaken, her composure completely shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the room, perhaps finally understanding the severity of her actions and their impact on those she claimed to love. After our honeymoon, a blissful escape where the world seemed to revolve around just the two of us, Jerian and I returned to a reality that had shifted in our absence. The news that greeted us was unexpected. Jerian's father had divorced Mrs. Eldridge. Despite his love for his mother, Jerian stood by his father's decision. Mrs. Eldridge, now living in a modest apartment and grappling with the new necessity of finding employment, seemed a world away from the woman who had looked down on me with such disdain. It was a drastic change in fortune that I wouldn't wish on anyone, despite our past. One afternoon, not long after our return, the phone rang. Expecting it to be Jerian, who had popped out for a short errand, I answered, only to find myself on the line with Mrs. Eldridge. The conversation began awkwardly, her voice cold and tinged with the contempt that had characterized our interactions. I suppose you're satisfied, seeing me in this state, she started, her words sharp. I held the phone a little tighter, struggling to keep my voice even. It's not about satisfaction. This was never what I wanted. As the call progressed, there was a noticeable shift in her tone. The arrogance and disdain gradually gave way to desperation. Listen, I need you to talk to them. To your father-in-law, to the grandmother. Maybe they'll listen to you. Tell them I'm sorry. That I'll change. Her plea took me by surprise. The woman who had once held herself so high was now begging for intercession. It was a moment that revealed the fragility beneath her previously unassailable facade. I took a deep breath before responding, my decision clear. I'm sorry, but that's not my place. This is something you need to address directly with them. They need to hear this from you, not me. Ending the call, I sat for a moment, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. When Jerian returned, I relayed the exchange, uncertain how he would react. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. After a pause, he spoke, his voice firm. You did the right thing. As much as I love my mom, she needs to understand the consequences of her actions. It's the only way she might truly change. His support was a balm, reaffirming the solidarity between us. This journey, with all its twists and turns, had brought us closer, cementing our bond through the challenges we faced together. As we moved forward, building our life together, the lessons of the past remained with us. A reminder of the resilience of love, the importance of forgiveness, and the strength found in standing united, even in the face of difficult family dynamics.